1 Samuel, the 21st chapter of 1 Samuel. And we'll be working out of there in just a moment. On Sunday night, we're in a sermon series entitled, The Life and Times of David. All the previous messages are on the Miles Road Baptist Church YouTube site. So if you've missed any of them, you can go to that site. You can find the messages you've missed so you can keep everything in order. But tonight, in the life and times of David, we're looking at a man on the run. A man on the run. Many years ago, some of you who have some age on you, you say, Pastor, who would that be? If your telephone's ringing, you answer it. Okay? But some time ago, for those of us who have some age on us, we can remember there was a television show on TV called The Fugitive. The series ran from 1963 through 1967 and featured Dr. Richard Kimball, who was a man on the run. He was a fugitive, if you will, as the show was so named. He was hunted down by law enforcement because he was falsely accused of killing his wife. Now that story, that series was make-believe, okay? It wasn't real, wasn't based on anything real, but it was make-believe. But tonight we're going to be looking at a man who was not make-believe. His story is not a fable or a fiction. We're looking at David tonight. And David, as we're going to study him tonight, is a man on the run. He is a fugitive. King Saul, who's on the throne of Israel, the first king of Israel, he hates David. And he wants David dead. For 8 long years, David will run from Saul. Saul trying to kill him. David will be a fugitive. Saul trying to kill him. And tonight we're looking at part of David's fugitive years. 1 Samuel chapter 21. I want you to read with me the first 3 verses, and then we will read verse 8 and 9. David at Nob. This is our first point. David at Nob. Remember, he's a man on the run. Well, where is he running to, Pastor? He's a fugitive. Where's he going to, Pastor? Well, in 1 Samuel 21, he's going to Nob. Why in the world would he go there? Verse 1, 1 Samuel 21. Now David came to Nob, to Abimelech the priest, and Ahimelech was afraid when he met David, said to him, Why are you alone, and no one is with you? This is the priest talking to David. Why are you alone? Where's all of your men? Where is your army? King Saul always sends you out with protection. Now, he doesn't know that David and King Saul are at odds with one another. That's why he asked the question, Why are you alone? No one's with you. Verse 2, David said to Ahimelech, the priest, The king has ordered me on some business. Now, David is doing what here? He's telling a what? Thank you. The king has ordered me on some business and said to me, Do not let anyone know anything about the business on which I send you or what I've commanded you. And I have directed my young men to such and such place. That's why they're not with me. Now therefore, what have you on hand? My men are hungry. Can you spare 5 loaves of bread in my hand? Or whatever can you find for me? So David comes to Nob asking the high priest for food, for bread. But that's not the only thing he asked for. Go to verse 8 and 9. David said to Ahimelech, Is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? I seem to have misplaced my sword. I seem to have forgotten to bring with me my spear. I and my men are hungry. We need bread to eat. I and my men don't have any weapons. Could you spare us a sword? Could you spare us a spear? David said, is there not here on hand a spear or a sword? Verse 8. For I have brought neither my sword nor my weapons with me, because the king's business required haste. I had to go quick. I didn't have time to get my gear. So the priest said, the sword of Goliath, the Philistine whom you killed in the valley of Elah, it is here. It's wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you will take that, take it, for there is no other except that one here. And David said, there is none like it. Give it to me. Now David's the man on the run. Saul is hunting him down. Saul wants to kill him. David is tired. He is hungry. And he is weaponless as we go into 1 Samuel 21. So he flees to the town of Nob. Nob is where the high priest and the priest of Israel stay. The tabernacle of God is there. And David goes to the high priest and he says, listen, I didn't have time to eat this morning, and neither did my men. Can you spare some bread? McDonald's is not open right now. And Hall's is too expensive. Could you feed my men some bread? We're hungry. And the priest agrees to feed his men holy bread. Not bread for ordinary people, bread that is basically reserved for the priest. But the priest in times of emergency could give it out to others. And David said, this is an emergency, and the high priest says, well, I can spare you 5 loaves. And then David says, listen, as you can see, I don't have my sword with me or my spear with me. I don't have any weapons with me. We had to get out of town fast to do what the king asked us to do. Couldn't draw no attention. Would you happen to have a sword? Would you happen to have a sword you could loan me? And the priest said, we don't normally have weapons. We're not soldiers. We're not combatants. We don't have such things here. But we do have one sword. Actually, David, it's your sword. It's the sword that you won when you slayed Goliath. This is Goliath's sword. Would you like that? And David says, I'll take it. And so he gets the sword to go with it. So he gets the bread to eat. He gets the sword for defense. Now, God has appointed David to be his man. David is God's man. But he's told how many lies? At least 2. Bold-faced lies, I might add. I don't have any bread because we didn't have time to get any. We're on the king's business. Had to get out quickly. And we don't have any weapons. Why? Because we had to go do the king's business and we didn't have time to gather our weapons, our gear. A man after God's own heart. Look up here at me now. A man after God's own heart. A man that is selected to one day be in God's Hall of Fame. He's an all-star for Jesus. And he tells 2 lies in a span of just a few minutes. His heart becomes dark. The heart that was supposed to be after God himself. Interesting. David the fugitive at Nob tells 2 lies, maybe more, to the high priest. It's one thing to lie to regular people, I suppose, but when you're lying to the representative of God on earth, that's a whole other story. And David told 2 lies to the high priest. And then he left. He went to another place. David went to Gath. If you have your Bibles, 1 Samuel 21, beginning with verse 10 through 15. Now remember, he's a man on the run, so that's why we're running through the Scriptures. Verse 10, David arose and fled that day from before Saul and went to Achish, the king of Gath. And the servants of Achish said to him, "Is this not David, the king of the land? Did they not sing of him to one another in dances? Did not they sing about him when they sang the chorus, 'Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s?'" Now David took these words to heart and was very much afraid of Achish, the king of Gath. So he changed his behavior before them. He pretended to be crazy, a madman in their hands. He scratched on the doors of the gate and let his saliva fall down on his beard. Achish said to his servants, "Look, you see the man that is insane? Why have you brought him to me? I've got enough crazy people already. Have I not need of a madman that you have brought this fellow to play the madman in my presence? Shall this fellow come into my house?" So David goes from Nob, where he has lied to two priests, where he's gotten bread and gotten a sword, and then goes to Gath. Now Gath is a Philistine town. It's not an Israeli town, it's a Philistine town. It would be like the Israelis in our modern day world going to Hamas's cities or Hezbollah's cities. Not very smart, would you not agree? But David right now is on a downward trajectory. When you start sinning, it'll affect the way you think sometimes, the way you talk, the way you act. And so David has in his mind, if I go to a Philistine town, King Saul, who's chasing after me, trying to kill me, he wouldn't go to a Philistine town. It would be too dangerous for him to do that. So I'm going to go. And so David goes to the Philistine town of Gath. He goes in disguise. Now, Gath is not only a Philistine town, look up here at me. It's the home of Goliath. Goliath's family lives in Gath. It's a town of darkness. It's a town of demonic activity. And David goes there in disguise to hide. But they recognize David. And they say, "King, I believe that's David. I believe that's the one that they sang about. I believe that's the one that they made choruses about. I believe that's the one that they had a parade for through Jerusalem." And so they identify David. They say, "Listen, you're David." And David panics now. So he pretends to be crazy. Have you ever pretended to be crazy? Or are you just crazy anyway? David pretends to be insane. He pretends to be a madman. He starts being delirious. He shakes gates. He kicks dirt. He slobbers. Let me just use the slobbers. All over his beard. He just acts nutty. And the king of Gath says, "I've got enough nuts here already. I don't need him. Get rid of him." Now, what you're looking at, ladies and gentlemen, is God's grace. I want you to understand that. Because if God wasn't being gracious to David, even though David right now is not in a good place, He would have let the king of Gath do what to David? Kill him. I often thought about that as I was studying this passage. Why didn't the king of the Philistines at Gath, why didn't he just kill David? Why didn't he just hang him up? Why didn't he take pictures of it? Why didn't he advertise, "We have killed David"? Because God, for reasons that God only knows, chose to step in and change his mind and heart. Instead of killing David, he just ran David off. Just ran David off. Now, think about this. David started off in Nob. He tells 2 lies. He didn't tell the truth. He goes now to Gath. He goes in disguise. A man of the light goes to a place of darkness. A man of righteousness goes to a place of wickedness. A man of God goes to a place of the devil. Can you imagine that? But that's what David does. The journey continues to go downward. From deception to disguises to wanting to associate himself with people and places of darkness and wickedness and depravity and decadence. And then David leaves there. I want you to notice in 1 Samuel 22, he goes to a place called Adullam. David therefore departed from there, speaking of Gath. He escaped to the cave of Adullam. So when his brothers and all his father's house heard it, they went down there to him. Word got out that David was now staying in Adullam. Saul hasn't heard it yet, but when he hears it, he's going to come after David. But right now, David is there, and word gets out that David needs some comrades. David needs some companions. David needs some support. So the word goes out, and they went down there to him. Verse Samuel 22, verse 1. And everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented came to him. So he became captain over them, and they were about 400 men with him. David has done what? He's lied. He's been deceptive. He's associated himself with darkness, demonic activity, wickedness, sin. And now he's in a place hiding out, and word gets out that he needs some supporters. Everything in the Bible has a point. Look at verse 2. This is who comes to David. The Navy SEALs, the Special Forces, the Army Rangers, the Green Berets, and the Special Ops. Is that what your Bible says? If it does, you need to get you another Bible. None of those come to David. Who comes to David? Well, look in front of you. I like how the author of this verse, God inspired it, the author of this verse is very diplomatic with his words. He must have been a politician. Everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was discontented gathered to him, and they made David their captain. And there was about 400 of them with him. I need some help. We got you covered, Pastor. We've just went down to the jailhouse where Scott Eady used to be. And we've let all those birds out, and they're going to come join you. Pastor, there's some deadbeats we've got. We're sending them to you. How about some outlaws? How about some hustlers and some rebels and some thieves and some villains and some vagabonds and some vagrants? Pastor, we're going to get you some support. You can count on us. And I'm sure David said, thank you. A fugitive, a man on the run. He's lied to escape. He's disguised himself to escape. He's associated with things of people and places that are not godly at all. And now he's going to call to his side a bunch of rabble-rousers. The highest of the high was David. And now he's the lowest of the low. Do you see how easy it is to get on this downward trajectory? Do you see that? Oh, I know it couldn't happen to you. It wouldn't happen to me. We're too smart. We're too savvy. We're too spiritual. But it happened to David. A man after God's own heart. An Hall of Famer, an all-star. One of the greatest men of God in the Bible. And tired and hungry and cold and wet, David lies. David deceives. David associates with things that no man of God should ever associate with. And now he's brought alongside of him the worst of the worst. But David's done one other thing. Worse than lying, Pastor? Worse than deception, Pastor? Worse than associating with people in places that are dark and demonic? Yes. Worse than having all of these people around him that are deplorables, perhaps? Yeah. David is a murderer. David is now responsible for the deaths of 85 priests, their wives, their parents, their sons, their daughters, their grandchildren, their pets, their donkeys, their sheep. David is responsible for their murder. You say, Pastor, how was he responsible? Did he do it? He just as well. Because when he went to Nob, he lied to the priest. That's why the priest gave him bread. If the priest would have known that King Saul didn't send him there, the high priest wouldn't have given David the bread. He wouldn't have given David the sword if he knew King Saul was coming. David wasn't part of King Saul. You see, the high priest, he didn't keep up with the newspaper. He didn't watch the radio or the television. All he knew was David and Saul worked together. And he was going to take care of David, God's man, King Saul's right hand. And so word gets back to King Saul that the high priest of Israel, 85 priests that lived there in that town of Nob with him, have helped public enemy number one, David. King Saul is already crazy. He's already paranoid. He's already schizophrenic. And when he hears what the high priest has done for David, his archenemy, Saul orders the high priest put to death. Every single one of them. And not just kill them, Saul orders. He said, I want their wives dead. I want their children dead. I want their grandchildren dead. I want their pets dead. I want their donkeys dead. I want their sheep dead. I want their livestock dead. I don't want one single thing left alive there. And we think Hamas is bad. That's what King Saul ordered. And then he sent one of his right-hand flunkies to do the job. And a slaughter took place, perhaps has never been seen before in the Bible up to this time. And David caused it. Because if David would have told the truth, this would have never happened. David's life, David's lies cost hundreds of people their lives. Look at 1 Samuel 22, 18 and 19. I'll show you there. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priest. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priest and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priest, he struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep. And he killed every one of them with the edge of the sword. Whew. Wow. You think David started out that way? You think he woke up one morning and said, I think I'll be a liar? You think a couple of weeks later he said, I think I'll go to the Philistine town. I think I'll disguise myself. I think I'll act crazy. I think I'll try to hide out there until they discover me. Then I'll get away. You think he thought about that? Do you think he went to Adullam and said, I want 400 men to join me? Bring me the most rottenest men you can find. Bring them to me. Do you think he wanted to see the slaughter take place in Nob that took place? No. Because when you sin against God, you don't think correctly. You don't feel correctly. You don't talk correctly. You don't act correctly. A man on the run, a fugitive. What can you and I take from this story tonight? Because remember, if all I do is tell you the story, and we don't talk about how the application is made to you and I, then I've really wasted telling you the story. The Bible has these stories not just to teach us history past, but to teach us history present. Not only to teach us what happened then, but what is happening now. Not just about what happened to David, but what could happen to you and I. And look up here at me. It might even be happening to you right now. Because we can do a wonderful job sometimes of suppressing what's going on in our lives until God brings it forth. And by the way, what you do in the dark will come to the light. So what can we walk away from this story? 4 things. First of all, a lack of faith will cause us to sin. A lack of faith. A lack of belief that what God says God will do. No if and buts about it. What God says is what God does. What God does is based on what God says. That's all faith is. I have heard God speak. I believe what God has said. I will act upon what God has told me to do. That's faith. And God is in the growing up of His children business. And the way He grows us is with faith. And the way that we get more faith is by God putting us in situations and circumstances where all we have is Him. But we learn that we can trust God. We don't have to trust ourselves. We don't have to trust others. God will always come through for us if we will trust Him and walk with Him by faith, not by understanding, by faith. God doesn't say, figure me out. We can't figure Him out. He doesn't say, try to understand my ways. We can't understand His ways. Just like a child will listen to their parent, God says, I'm your heavenly Father. Listen to me. Lack of faith. Do you think God could have taken care of David? Yes or no? David was hungry. Do you think God could have provided bread for him without him lying to the high priest? Do you think God could have done that? Do you think God could have protected David without David lying to the high priest that he needs a weapon? Sure, He could have. God is Jehovah Jireh. He revealed Himself to Abraham as the God who provides. God could have very well provided David all the food he needed, and would have, by the way. He would have protected David with all the protection he needed. And he would have. But David, like you and I, did not have faith. His faith was weak at that time. And so David says, I'm hungry, I will do it myself. I'm defenseless. I must get weapons. I will get them myself. And if I have to lie to get them, that's okay. God understands. No, He doesn't. No, He doesn't. A lack of faith will causes us to sin. Do you have faith? Do you believe God will do for you what He says He will do? Or do you feel like I got to take it into my own hands? I've got to do it my way, even if it means deceit, even if it means lies. Lack of faith causes us to sin. It started the downhill for David. Secondly, we can learn from this that sin will grow in size and strength when it's left unconfessed. Sin will never stay the same size. If it's not dealt with, it will get bigger and bigger, increase in size, increase in intensity. Sin never stays the same. It's either forgiven and forgotten forever, amen, or it dwells within us and it constantly grows in size, in strength, increases in frequency, increases in intensity. David started out doing what? Lying. And from lies he went into darkness. From darkness he went into rogues. And from rogues he would go into murder. David went tumbling down. You say, but Pastor, the sin that I enjoy is just a little sin. But you know something? That little sin grows up and one day becomes a big sin. You take sin, then sin will take you. And David is finding that out. Because I believe after he lied, that's where he intended not to do any more. But then he did more, then he did more, then he did more. Sin grows in size and strength when it's left unconfessed. A lack of faith causes us to sin by and large. We don't believe God can do what we will do for ourselves. Thirdly, all sin can be forgiven when it's acknowledged and confessed. All sin. Not ivory soap, 99.9 or whatever that figure is. All sin. All sin, when acknowledged, confessed, repented of, can be forgiven. Do you understand that? You know why David was a man after God's own heart? Not because he was perfect, not because he always did everything right. In fact, David was very far from imperfect, and he did a lot of things wrong. But eventually, David always looked in the mirror, and he said, I see the sinner, and it's me. 1 Samuel 22, verse 22. Listen to what David says when he hears about what happened in the town of Nob and how 85 priests are dead, their families are dead, their pets are dead, everything is dead. Notice what David says. Now keep your Bibles open, pay attention. David speaks. He says, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there, that he would surely tell Saul what I did. I have caused the death. This is David speaking. I have caused the death of all the persons in your father's house. Now you may not think that says much, but it says a lot. Because when we sin, how many of us say, I sinned? Lord, I did it. I did it deliberately. I did it intentionally. I did it knowingly. I have no defense. I have no alibi. I have no excuse. Lord, I knew exactly what I was doing. I chose to do it anyway. God, I'm so sorry. I have sinned against you. I've sinned against others, but I've sinned against you. I've sinned against myself, but I've sinned against you. All sin is against God. And David says when he hears of the deaths of the priests and all the slaughter that took place, he says, I have caused the death. Do you do that with your sin? Or do you say, I sin, but whenever you put a B-U-T on it, it's not acknowledgement and it's not confession. I wouldn't have cussed if you wouldn't have got me mad. I wouldn't have looked at that pornography if you would have guarded the computer. I wouldn't have stolen if you would have paid me the right amount of money that you owed me. I wouldn't have done what I did, but it's your fault that I did it. That's the way we confess our sin. Lord, if I've done anything, yes, you've done everything, and so have I. And David looked in the mirror and he said, there's a liar, and it's me. There's a man who associated with darkness and demonic activity. It is me. There's a man who associated himself with the rogues of society. Me. There's a man responsible for the murder that has taken place. It is me. God, it is me. And God can do business with a man who will admit and acknowledge what he's done and take responsibility and accountability for it and seek to correct it. Lack of faith causes us to sin. Sin grows in size and strength when it goes unconfessed. Sin can be forgiven. All sin can be forgiven when it's acknowledged and admitted to and confessed and repented of. And then lastly, no one is immune from sin. No one. That's important we hear that. Because some of you right now are looking at me and you say, well, Pastor, you don't understand. I'm pretty strong. And certain things don't bother me. I can say no to them, Pastor. So you might be right on a few sins, but when you say no one is immune from sin, I'm telling you I'm immune for most of it. You are, huh? He who pats himself on the back and brags about how strong he is, take heed, lest he what? Fall. I would never cheat on my spouse, Pastor. I would never do it. Really? I hope that you'll never have to be put in a place to find out. I would never steal money from my boss. You wouldn't? I hope you're never put in a position to find out. I would never take somebody's life. Pastor, I can't imagine I would ever hurt anybody, much less kill them. I hope you're never put in that position to find out. Pastor, I would never drink alcohol or smoke pot or shoot juice up into my veins or inhale this or smoke that. You wouldn't? I hope you're never put in a position to find out. I would never sell my body for money. I would never be a prostitute. I'd never be a pimp. Hope you're never put in a position to find out. I would never lie or cheat. I would never forsake the Lord, Pastor. I'll be here today, I'll be here next week, I'll be here next month, I'll be here next year. When the church doors are open, you can count on me. I hope you're never put to the test. Because I think what we would find is we're all weak. We're all wicked. And put in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong circumstance and the wrong people. And there's not a one of us here that would not sin against God. And then try to cover it up to get away with it. You see, every man has a price. And maybe your price hasn't been paid yet for you to do the sin that David did. I close by telling you a story. Many years ago, when I was pastoring in Sumter, a professional wrestler by the name of Tully Blanchard got saved. Tully was one of the original Four Horsemen for anybody who follows wrestling. In other words, he was a big name. His salary was about $500,000 a year, and that was around 1984, 1985, I guess. That's a lot of money back then. $500,000 a year for getting in a ring and doing choreographed wrestling. Well, he got saved. Tully Blanchard, the arrogant Four Horsemen, very narcissistic, very prideful, in person as well as in the ring. He gave his life to Jesus in Atlanta, Georgia. Cried out to God one night to save him because he was going through some things that he never thought would happen. And God saved him. Whosoever calls upon the name of the Lord shall be saved. And God saved Tully Blanchard. And Tully Blanchard and I met not shortly after that. I was a young pastor. He was a young Christian. I invited him to come and spend some time with me in Sumter and also give a testimony at my church. And in talking with Tully, I thought he said something interesting. He said, I'm having a hard time with my salvation. I'm having a hard time with my commitment to Christ. I said, well, what is the struggle, Tully? He said, I feel pressured to go back into wrestling. My wife is pressuring me. My family's pressuring me. I'm pressuring me. And outside forces are pressuring me to go back into wrestling. And he said, Pastor, I know if I go back into wrestling, I will not live for the Lord. There's a lot of drinking that goes on. There's a lot of doping. There's a lot of sexual immorality. It's just not a place that a Christian needs to be in. I said, well, what's the struggle, Tully? I mean, you don't have to go back. Years on. He said, I got a job after I got saved. I left wrestling. I got a job working at a recreational center of a church. I was the educational, recreational minister. And they paid me $250 a week. That's it. No benefits, no insurance. $250 a week to be a staff minister, minister of recreation at this church. He said, Pastor, I left wrestling making $500,000 a year. I can't live on $250 a week. I can't. And that's the temptation, and that's the struggle. I can't live on that amount of money. You see, circumstance and situation has a lot to do with sometimes what we do or don't do. And by the way, he resisted going back into wrestling. Later, the Lord would lead him into his own evangelistic ministry. And he would be able to make enough income to be able to support his family. Certainly not at what he used to make, but far more than what he was receiving as a recreational minister at a church. It's easy to throw stones at people. I could have easily said, well, Tully, I don't have no problem with that. Why is it bothering you? Don't bother me. Because I've never made $500,000 a year to be bothered. And neither of you. But suppose somebody offered you $30,000 more than you're making right now to do something that's questionable, that's shady, that you know if you did it, it would lead you away from your family, more importantly, away from the Lord. Would you do it? See, you'd be tempted, wouldn't you? David was tempted, and David fell. But by God's grace, he got back up. He got cleaned up, and God sent him on. Heads are bowed and eyes are closed.